They really thought they'd gotten away with it. Two fake cops wearing cheap uniforms smashed my Jeep Wrangler with batons in broad daylight, then sped off like amateur criminals. What they didn't know was that every second had been recorded by 6 different cameras, and the person they'd just messed with was the newly appointed sheriff of Oakland County, a position I'd held for exactly 9 days. Before we dive into this, let me know what country you're watching from. Let's see where this story goes. But before all of that, before the arrests, before the shock, before the handcuffs, here's how everything really started. It was 9:47 a.m. on a cold November morning when I heard the first impact. I was upstairs in my home office at Lakewood Meadows, reviewing personnel files for the department, when the sound of shattering glass cut through the quiet neighborhood. My training kicked in immediately. I grabbed my phone, opened the camera app, and moved to the window that overlooked my driveway, already thinking about evidence documentation and chain of custody. What I saw confirmed my instinct to record first and react later. 2 men in what looked like Oakland County Sheriff's Office uniforms were attacking my 2022 Jeep Wrangler with tactical batons. The taller one had a scruffy beard and moved with manufactured authority. The shorter one was overweight, sweat already staining his collar despite the cold air, and he kept glancing nervously toward the street like someone expecting to get caught. I zoomed in with my phone camera, making sure to capture every detail. Badge number 8,847 on the tall one, badge number 3,312 on the short one. But something was immediately wrong. The uniforms were cheap polyester instead of department-issued wool blend. The badges had the plastic shine of costume jewelry, and their boots were discount store tactical knockoffs. I kept recording as they shattered both headlights, cracked the passenger side mirror, and scraped deep gouges into the driver's door with the edge of a baton. The damage was systematic and deliberate. I estimated at least $3,200 in repairs, enough to cross the felony threshold under Michigan law. That number mattered. It was the difference between a misdemeanor property crime and serious prison time. Then I heard the voice that made everything click into place. "Keith, you owe us $12,000. The words came from a white Mercedes parked at the end of my driveway, and I recognized that sharp, entitled tone immediately. Karen Devereaux, former president of the Lakewood Meadows Homeowners Association. 2 years ago, I'd sued her for fraud after she forged property line maps to claim my house fell under HOA jurisdiction. She'd been convicted of harassment, forgery, and attempted extortion, then sentenced to 18 months in prison. She'd been released just 16 days ago and apparently decided that attacking a sheriff's personal vehicle was a smart way to spend her newfound freedom. The woman had learned absolutely nothing. I kept my phone steady, recording as Karen stepped out of the Mercedes. She was 55 years old but carried herself with the kind of entitlement that comes from never facing real consequences. Designer sunglasses, expensive jewelry, and a posture that radiated arrogance. She pointed at my Jeep and said something to the 2 fake cops that I couldn't hear, but her body language was unmistakable. She was directing them, orchestrating this attack like she still had power over something. The shorter fake cop nodded and delivered one final blow to the rear taillight. Then both of them jogged back to a dark blue pickup truck parked behind the Mercedes. Within 30 seconds, all 3 vehicles were gone, leaving nothing but broken glass and plastic fragments scattered across my driveway. I had 16 minutes of footage showing their faces, their movements, their fake badge numbers, and Karen giving directions. That was more than enough. I didn't go outside. Strategic documentation came first. I made 2 phone calls while the evidence was fresh. The first was to dispatch at the Oakland County Sheriff's Office. "This is Sheriff Holland. I need you to run 2 badge numbers for me, 8,847 and 3,312. There was a pause. Then the dispatcher's voice came back with exactly the answer I expected. "Sir, badge 8,847 doesn't exist in our system. Badge 3,312 was retired in 2019 when Deputy Marcus Chen left the department." I thanked her and hung up. The second call was to my deputy chief, James Crawford. "I need surveillance footage pulled from a 500-yard radius around my home address. Traffic cameras, doorbell cameras, security systems, everything within range. My phone recording caught the attack, but I want corroborating angles from the neighborhood cameras, and I need a bolo on a white Mercedes. License plate 7 KHJ 829. Don't stop it. Don't approach it. Just track it. Crawford didn't ask questions. He just said, "On it, sir," and the line went dead. I walked to my home office and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside was my service weapon, a Glock 22, my duty belt, and most importantly, my badge. Sheriff's badge number 1001. I picked it up, feeling the weight of real authority in my hand, not the plastic garbage those two idiots had been wearing. Karen Devereaux had no idea who she was dealing with. She thought she was attacking Keith Holland, the guy who beat her in civil court. She didn't know she was attacking Sheriff Keith Holland, the man who now controlled county law enforcement resources and had 2 decades of experience building airtight cases. That miscalculation was going to cost her years, not months. I set the badge down and pulled up the video I'd just recorded on my phone. 16 minutes of crystal clear footage showing 2 men in fake police uniforms committing criminal mischief, property destruction, and impersonating peace officers. Michigan Penal Code 750.215 made impersonating a police officer a felony, punishable by up to 4 years in prison. Combined with the property damage and Karen's status as a recent parolee with a fraud conviction, this wasn't going to end with a fine and probation. This was going to be a case study in what happens when you commit felonies against someone who understands how the legal system actually works. I saved 3 backup copies of the video, 1 to my personal cloud, 1 to a secure thumb drive, and 1 directly to the department's evidence server. Then I sat back in my chair and allowed myself one small smile. Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her post-prison life. She thought she was getting revenge. What she'd actually done was hand me everything I needed to put her back behind bars. And this time, the sentence was going to be significantly longer than 18 months. The attack on my Jeep wasn't random violence. It was the continuation of a pattern that had started 2 years earlier, when I'd made the mistake of buying a beautiful house in what I thought was a peaceful neighborhood. Lakewood Meadows had seemed perfect when I first toured the property in early 2023. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, and, according to the county surveyor's official map, my lot sat exactly 50 feet outside the homeowners association boundary. That detail mattered to me because I'd spent 20 years dealing with petty bureaucrats in law enforcement, and I had no interest in dealing with them in my personal life. I bought the house specifically because I wouldn't have to answer to an HOA board. Karen Devereaux had other ideas. 3 weeks after I moved in, I received a letter on official Lakewood Meadows HOA letterhead demanding payment for 15 months of fabricated violations that predated my ownership. The letter included a map that showed my property inside the HOA boundary, but the forgery was clumsy. The boundary line had been moved exactly 52 feet to include my house. I hired a licensed county surveyor who confirmed what the original records showed. My property ended 50 feet before the HOA boundary began. When I sent Karen the official survey results and requested a retraction, her response was a threat. Pay or face a lien and legal action. That's when I stopped being polite and started building a case. The lawsuit I filed was straightforward. Official county survey versus forged HOA map. Fabricated violation notices. Text messages between Karen and other board members discussing how to force me out. The jury took 45 minutes to convict her on fraud, harassment, and attempted extortion charges. The judge ordered her to pay $25,000 in damages plus $8,000 in court costs. What mattered more than the money was the prison time. Karen went away convinced she'd been wronged. Not that she'd committed crimes. That kind of mindset doesn't rehabilitate behind bars. It ferments. And 16 days after her release, she proved exactly that by sending fake cops to destroy my vehicle. What I didn't know until this morning was that the HOA itself had never actually disbanded, while Karen served her sentence. Her son Dylan Devereaux took over as the de facto operator. He was 32 years old, had a business degree from a mid-tier state school, and possessed just enough intelligence to think he could run the same scam as his mother without getting caught. His strategy was smarter on the surface. Instead of directly demanding fake violation fees, he created Devereaux Protection Services, LLC, registered it as a legitimate security company in March of 2024, and offered it as a solution to HOA compliance problems he'd invented. Pay for our protection services, and all your violations disappear. It was extortion dressed up as a business transaction, and for 8 months. It had worked because victims thought they were dealing with a real company, not a continuation of his mother's criminal enterprise. Deputy Chief Crawford called me back at 11:15 a.m. with preliminary findings. His voice was tight with controlled anger. "Sir, we've got a problem. I pulled complaints from the past 8 months. 4 families in Lakewood Meadows filed reports about threatening letters from the HOA demanding payment for security services. The total amount demanded across all 4 families is $37,000. None of them knew the others had been targeted. They all thought they were isolated incidents." I felt my jaw tighten. This wasn't just about my Jeep anymore. This was systematic. Karen's attack this morning wasn't personal revenge. It was a message meant to intimidate me the same way Dylan had been intimidating other residents for months. But she'd made a critical error. She'd gone after someone who had the resources and authority to dismantle the entire operation. I asked Crawford to send me everything he had. Every complaint, every letter, every name. He promised to have it on my desk within the hour. While I waited, I pulled up Michigan's business registry and searched for Devereaux Protection Services, LLC. The company showed Dylan as CEO and registered agent, with a business address that matched Karen's home. The website looked professional until you examined it closely. Stock photos of security guards that reverse image searched back to a generic photography site. Client testimonials with names that didn't appear in any public records. A list of services that included HOA compliance enforcement, which wasn't even a real security function. This wasn't a legitimate business. It was a front for organized harassment. And the 2 fake cops who'd attacked my Jeep this morning were almost certainly part of Dylan's operation. I spent the rest of the morning building a timeline. Karen was convicted and sentenced in late 2023. Dylan registers Devereaux Protection Services in March 2024. The first complaint was filed against the fake security company in April. 4 families were targeted over 8 months for a total of $37,000. Karen was released 16 days ago and immediately involved in directing fake police to commit felony property destruction. The pattern was clear. This was a family business built on fraud, and Karen's release had emboldened Dylan to escalate. What they didn't understand was that escalation works both ways. They'd moved from civil harassment to criminal conspiracy, from fake HOA fees to impersonating law enforcement. Every step up that ladder added years to potential prison sentences. I opened a new case file on my laptop and titled it, Devereaux Organized Fraud Investigation. This wasn't going to be a simple assault charge anymore. This was going to be a systematic takedown. And by the time I was done, both Karen and Dylan would understand exactly what happens when you turn a neighborhood into your personal criminal enterprise. By 2 p.m. that afternoon, I had everything I needed to understand the real scope of what Karen and Dylan had been running. Deputy Chief Crawford delivered a file box to my office containing 8 months of complaints, preliminary financial records obtained through cooperative bank inquiries, and business registration documents for Devereaux Protection Services, LLC. What I found inside that box transformed this from a property crime investigation into something much larger. This wasn't just intimidation. This was organized fraud on a scale that carried felony charges with prison sentences measured in decades. The numbers told a story that even I, with 20 years of investigating financial crimes, hadn't fully anticipated. The bank records showed that Devereaux Protection Services had collected $140,000 over 8 months from 23 different families in Lakewood Meadows. Each family had been threatened with fabricated HOA violations, then offered the same solution: pay between $4,000 and $8,000 per year for protection services, and your compliance problems disappear. The contracts Dylan created looked legitimate on the surface, complete with corporate letterhead and liability clauses, but every single one was based on violations that didn't exist and enforced by an HOA that had no legal authority. It was extortion with a corporate logo, and it had been effective because people assumed professional paperwork meant legitimacy. What made the scheme particularly calculated was how Dylan structured the money flow to look like legitimate business revenue before transferring it to personal accounts. The financial trail revealed the real motive behind this morning's attack. Over the past 16 days, $85,000 had moved from Dylan's business account into a personal account Karen had opened immediately after her release. That number was significant because Karen still owed $33,000 in unpaid damages and court costs from our original lawsuit, money she'd refused to pay even after conviction. She wasn't running this scam just for revenge. She was running it to avoid the financial consequences of her first crime, and the attack on my Jeep was designed to intimidate me into dropping collection efforts on her debt. Every threatening letter, every fake violation notice, every dollar extracted from frightened homeowners was part of a strategy to rebuild the money she'd lost and punish anyone who'd held her accountable. But the financial investigation revealed something that elevated this beyond simple fraud. Dylan had spent $15,000 on law enforcement costume suppliers and another $8,000 on manufacturers of fake badges that mimicked Oakland County Sheriff's Office designs. The receipts were itemized and dated, creating a timeline of deliberate preparation, according to Michigan Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs records. Devereaux Protection Services had never applied for the required private security agency license that state law mandated. Dylan had been operating an unlicensed business for 8 months, employing unlicensed individuals and equipping them with fake law enforcement gear. Under Michigan law, operating a security business without proper licensing was a misdemeanor, but using that business to impersonate police officers made it a felony conspiracy. I cross-referenced the employee records with criminal background databases and confirmed the identities of the 2 men who'd attacked my Jeep. Randy Moss, 41 years old, with a prior aggravated assault conviction. Darren Koch, 38 years old, with a theft record. Neither had any legitimate law enforcement or security experience. Both had been hired in the past 4 months and paid in cash for what sparse records called compliance enforcement services. The fact that Dylan had hired violent offenders and equipped them with fake police uniforms meant that families in Lakewood Meadows had been opening their doors to criminals, believing they were legitimate security personnel. That wasn't just fraud anymore. It was a public safety threat. I called County Prosecutor Lisa Montgomery and walked her through what we'd found. She was 50 years old, had a conviction rate that made defense attorneys nervous, and she grasped the implications immediately. Sheriff, if you can prove organized fraud over $100,000 with multiple victims and show that Karen directed criminal acts while on parole, we're looking at felony charges carrying 5 to 20 years. Add conspiracy to impersonate officers and obstruction of justice. And we can structure this as a RICO-adjacent case. But I need direct evidence linking Karen to the operational decisions, not just financial benefit. I told her I'd have that evidence within the hour. The last piece came from a search warrant Crawford's team had executed on Dylan's business address, which turned out to be Karen's home with a fake office in the garage. Inside the desktop computer, investigators found spreadsheets tracking which families had been targeted and how much each had paid, along with templates for fake violation notices and enforcement protocols. But the most damning evidence was an email chain from 2 weeks ago. Karen had written, "We need to send a message to Holland. He's the reason I lost everything. If he thinks he can collect on that judgment, he needs to understand we have enforcement capabilities now." Dylan's response was direct. "I'll handle it. Randy and Darren can make a statement he won't forget." That email was the connection prosecutors needed. Karen hadn't just benefited from Dylan's operation. She'd specifically ordered the attack on my property as retaliation for the court judgment against her. That single email transformed this morning's vandalism into witness intimidation and obstruction of justice under Michigan Penal Code 750.505, which made it a felony to interfere with someone participating in a civil or criminal proceeding. Karen had just added another charge to a list that was growing by the hour. I forwarded the email to Montgomery, added it to the evidence file, and felt the case solidify into something airtight. Karen and Dylan thought they were running a sophisticated criminal enterprise. What they'd actually created was a comprehensive record of conspiracy, documented in spreadsheets, emails, and bank transfers that would make convictions almost effortless. The attack on my Jeep wasn't just a crime. It was the mistake that would unravel everything they'd built. And based on the evidence I was holding, their next address was going to be a prison cell, and the length of stay was going to be measured in decades. I issued the summons at 4:30 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, exactly 3 days after the attack on my Jeep. 4 separate documents, delivered by uniformed deputies to Karen Devereaux, Dylan Devereaux, Randy Moss, and Darren Koch. The summons required their presence at Oakland County Sheriff's Office headquarters, Interrogation Room 3, at 9 a.m. the following morning. It was a formal invitation they couldn't refuse, and I made sure the language was clear. This wasn't a request for voluntary cooperation. This was a lawful order to appear for questioning regarding felony charges, including conspiracy to commit fraud, impersonating peace officers, extortion, and obstruction of justice. I wanted them to spend the night thinking about what was coming. Wanted them to feel the weight of real authority pressing down after months of pretending they had power they'd never actually possessed. Karen arrived with a lawyer. His name was Robert Finch, 60 years old, a civil defense attorney who specialized in HOA disputes and property law. He was competent in his narrow field but completely out of his depth in a criminal conspiracy investigation. I could see it in his face the moment he walked into the interrogation room and saw the evidence boxes stacked against the wall, each one labeled with case numbers and chain of custody documentation. Karen sat down across from me with the same entitled posture she'd had 3 days ago, but there was something different in her eyes now. Uncertainty, maybe the beginning of fear. I delivered the Miranda warning first, made it clear she could leave but would be arrested within the hour if she did. Finch started to object to harassment, but I cut him off. Karen stayed. That was her second mistake. I opened the first evidence folder and laid out 6 still frames from multiple camera angles showing Randy Moss and Darren Koch in fake uniforms destroying my Jeep while Karen directed them from beside her Mercedes. I pointed to the fabricated badge numbers without repeating their details. Both men were wearing purchased costumes designed to impersonate law enforcement officers. Combined with the $3,200 in property damage, we're looking at multiple felonies with significant prison time. I moved immediately to the bank records, spreading them across the table. $140,000 collected through Devereaux Protection Services. $85,000 transferred to your personal account. That's organized fraud carrying 5 to 20 years under Michigan law. Karen glanced at Finch, but he had nothing. The numbers were documented, and the pattern was clear. I pulled out the email chain recovered from Dylan's computer and read the key lines aloud. Your message to Dylan 2 weeks ago, we need to send a message to Holland. He needs to understand we have enforcement capabilities. Dylan's response, I'll handle it. Randy and Darren can make a statement he won't forget. I let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. You directed this attack as retaliation for a lawful court judgment. That's witness intimidation. Another felony carrying up to 10 years. Karen finally broke, pointing toward the adjacent room where Dylan was being questioned. He ran the whole operation. I didn't know what he was doing until I got out. He told me it was a legitimate security business. I slid the transaction records across the table showing her account receiving payments 6 months ago, 3 months before her release. You were receiving deposits while incarcerated. Prison mail logs show you corresponded with Dylan about business operations throughout your sentence. You knew exactly what he was doing. Finch put his hand on Karen's arm, trying to stop her from talking, but she was spiraling. Dylan told me it was legal. He said it was just HOA enforcement. I didn't know about the fake badges until this week. That admission was the moment I'd been waiting for. She'd just confirmed knowledge of the impersonation scheme, even if recently. That single sentence was going to cost her years. But I had one more piece of evidence that would eliminate any remaining doubt about her direct involvement. I pulled out a photograph recovered from Randy Moss's phone, seized during his arrest that morning. The image showed Randy in the fake uniform with a text caption reading "Easy Money" and a timestamp from 2 months ago. Below it was the text exchange I needed. Randy to Karen. Job done on Holland's Jeep. $2,000 like you promised. Right. Karen's response. Cash. Tonight. I slid the phone across the table and watched her face go pale. Randy Moss has already given a full statement. He identified you as the person who hired him, provided the uniform, and paid him $2,000 in cash to vandalize my vehicle. Darren Koch confirmed the same story independently. I let the silence stretch for 5 full seconds before continuing. You're not just an accessory, Mrs. Devereaux. You're the principal organizer. Karen stared at the phone screen like it contained evidence of her own execution. Finch stood up and demanded an end to the interrogation, but it was already over. Every element was documented, corroborated, and legally obtained. I stood and gathered the evidence folders, stacking them methodically. Based on this evidence, I'm recommending felony charges for organized fraud, conspiracy to impersonate peace officers, extortion, criminal mischief, and obstruction of justice. The combined maximum sentence is 59 years. However, because you're a repeat offender with a prior felony conviction less than 5 years old, Michigan sentencing guidelines require enhanced penalties of 50 to 100%. I watched the math sink in as her face collapsed. She wasn't looking at months. She was looking at decades. Finch made one desperate attempt at negotiating a plea, but I shook my head. That's a conversation for the prosecutor's office. My job was to collect evidence and present facts. I've done that. I looked directly at Karen one last time. What happens next is up to you and the justice system you tried to manipulate. I walked out of the interrogation room and closed the door behind me. In the adjacent room, Dylan was having his own reckoning as deputies presented the same evidence packages with his name attached to corporate documents, bank transfers, and employee hiring records. By noon, both of them would understand exactly how badly they'd miscalculated. They'd thought dressing criminals in fake uniforms and calling it a security company made them untouchable. What they'd actually done was document every step of a criminal conspiracy in emails, spreadsheets, and bank statements that prosecutors would use to put them away for years. The attack on my Jeep wasn't just a crime. It was the mistake that connected every thread of evidence into a case so airtight that even the best criminal defense attorney in the state couldn't unravel it. Karen had spent 18 months in prison and learned nothing. This time, the education was going to last considerably longer. Dylan called an emergency HOA meeting for 7 p.m. that same evening. I found out from Deputy Chief Crawford, who'd been monitoring communications after we'd released both Karen and Dylan following their interrogations. They weren't under arrest yet because I wanted to give them rope to hang themselves in front of the entire community. The meeting notice went to all 47 households with a subject line reading, "Urgent address, false accusations against HOA leadership." Dylan's strategy was transparent: paint himself and his mother as victims of my abuse of authority. Rally community support before formal charges were filed. It was desperate, but it was also exactly the opportunity I'd been waiting for. Public accountability required a public stage, and Dylan had just built one. I arrived at 6:55 p.m. wearing a full sheriff's uniform. Badge number 1001 visible. I brought 4 deputies and County Prosecutor Lisa Montgomery. The hall was nearly full. Roughly 80 to 90 people from 47 households. Some faces I recognized from victim statements. Others were probably Dylan's supporters who didn't know what had been happening. Karen and Dylan stood at the front near a projection screen. Karen's face went white when she saw me in uniform with prosecutors and deputies. Dylan's hands shook as he started the meeting, claiming I was abusing my position to harass them over a personal dispute, using county resources to investigate a legitimate business. A few people nodded along, but others shifted uncomfortably. These were people who'd paid thousands to make fake violations disappear. I waited until Dylan finished and opened the floor for questions. Then I stood. The room went silent. "Mr. Devereaux, you've made serious allegations. I'd like to address them directly, with evidence, if you'll allow me." Dylan looked trapped. He nodded stiffly and stepped aside. I connected my laptop to the projection screen. 3 days ago, 2 men wearing fake law enforcement uniforms attacked my vehicle while Mrs. Devereaux directed them. I played 4 minutes of condensed footage from 6 camera angles showing Randy Moss and Darren Koch destroying my Jeep while Karen pointed and gave directions. The room was silent except for shattering glass. "Those 2 men are in custody, facing felony charges." I clicked the bank records in chart form. As established in the investigation, Devereaux Protection Services collected significant funds from families here. The business has no valid state license. Contracts were based on fabricated violations. I showed the email between Karen and Dylan about sending me a message. Then Karen broke. She stepped forward, voice rising. "This is all lies. Where are your people? The security team handled the Holland situation. They told me they took care of it." The room went dead silent. Dylan looked horrified. Karen had just confessed to ordering the attack in front of the entire community and law enforcement witnesses. Prosecutor Montgomery was writing notes, documenting the spontaneous admission. I didn't gloat. I clicked to the final slide showing charges and spoke to the audience. "If anyone has been contacted by Devereaux Protection Services, threatened with violations, or paid money to make problems disappear, come forward. You're victims of fraud. The prosecutor's office will help you recover losses. 4 people stood immediately. Then 6 more. A woman said, "They threatened to lien my house if I didn't pay $6,000. A man added, "I paid $4,500 because everything looked official." The floodgates opened. Person after person shared similar stories. An elderly couple who'd paid $7,000. A single mother threatened over mailbox colors. A veteran intimidated by fake badges. Each testimony added weight, and the community watched it unfold in real time. The anger wasn't directed at me. It was directed at the 2 people who'd weaponized official-looking paperwork to steal from families who'd trusted that uniforms meant legitimacy. I signaled my deputies. They moved forward with handcuffs. I read Karen and Dylan their rights, voice calm and professional. Karen Devereaux, you are under arrest for organized fraud, conspiracy to commit felony impersonation of peace officers, extortion, and obstruction of justice. Dylan Devereaux, you are under arrest for organized fraud, extortion, and operating an unlicensed security business. As handcuffs clicked, I heard scattered applause, then more, until most of the room was clapping. They were celebrating accountability. The moment people who'd used fake authority were held responsible by real authority. I escorted them into separate patrol vehicles. Karen was crying, the entitled posture gone, replaced by reality. This was public exposure. Not hidden deals, but justice delivered in full view of the community that had suffered. As I closed the patrol car door, I could see neighbors gathering, sharing experiences, realizing they weren't alone. The meeting Dylan called to rally support had become the forum where his operation collapsed. Karen had spent 18 months in prison and learned nothing except how to run a bigger scam. This time, the education was going to last considerably longer, and it was going to happen in front of everyone she'd tried to manipulate. 6 weeks later, I sat in Oakland County Circuit Court and watched justice move through its final procedures. The courtroom was packed with faces I recognized from that community hall meeting. Residents of Lakewood Meadows who'd taken time off work to witness the conclusion of a case that had affected their lives directly. Honorable Judge Patricia Brennan, 58 years old with a reputation for thorough sentencing and zero tolerance for repeat offenders, presided over the proceedings with the kind of calm authority that comes from decades on the bench. Karen and Dylan sat at separate defense tables with their attorneys, both having accepted plea agreements after realizing that taking this case to trial would only result in harsher sentences. The evidence was overwhelming. The witness testimony was consistent, and the financial documentation left no room for reasonable doubt. Judge Brennan reviewed the case files methodically before addressing the court. This case represents a systematic exploitation of community trust through fraudulent business practices, impersonation of law enforcement, and financial extortion spanning 8 months. The defendants created an elaborate scheme that collected $140,000 from 23 families using fabricated violations and fake authority. The harm extends beyond financial loss. It includes psychological intimidation, erosion of community safety, and abuse of symbols of legitimate law enforcement. She turned to Karen first. "Mrs. Devereaux, you were released from prison after serving time for fraud and harassment. 16 days later, you directed employees to commit felony vandalism while impersonating peace officers. You received $85,000 in proceeds from an unlicensed fraud operation while still owing $33,000 in court-ordered restitution from your previous conviction. This court views your actions as demonstrating willful disregard for the law and contempt for the justice system." The sentencing was precise and unforgiving. Karen Devereaux received 12 years in prison with no eligibility for parole for the first 5 years. The charges included organized fraud, conspiracy to commit felony impersonation of peace officers, extortion, criminal mischief, and obstruction of justice, because she was a repeat offender who'd committed new felonies within 2 years of release. Michigan sentencing guidelines mandated enhanced penalties. Her sentence was 50% longer than it would have been for a first-time offender. Additionally, the court ordered her to pay $180,000 in restitution and fines, which included full compensation to all 23 victim families, repayment of my vehicle damage, and court costs. The court also ordered seizure of all assets connected to the fraud operation, including Karen's personal accounts, vehicles, and property holdings valued at $95,000. Those assets would be liquidated and distributed to victims as partial restitution. Dylan Devereaux received 8 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 4 years contingent on good behavior and completion of financial restitution obligations. His charges included organized fraud, extortion, and operating an unlicensed security business. The court noted that while Dylan had initiated the fraudulent company, his mother's involvement and direction after her release had escalated the criminal conspiracy to include violent intimidation. Dylan was ordered to pay $75,000 in restitution and was permanently banned from operating any business in Michigan for 15 years following his release. Judge Brennan made it clear that any future business activities would be subject to intense regulatory scrutiny and that violation of the ban would result in immediate reincarceration. Randy Moss and Darren Koch each received 4 years in prison for impersonating peace officers and criminal mischief. Both had accepted plea agreements in exchange for their testimony against Karen and Dylan. Each was ordered to pay $10,000 in fines and was prohibited from working in any security-related field for life. The judge noted that their willingness to wear fake law enforcement uniforms and use them to intimidate citizens represented a fundamental betrayal of public trust that warranted serious consequences regardless of who had hired them. The courtroom was silent as Judge Brennan delivered her final remarks. The defendants in this case weaponized the symbols of authority to exploit their neighbors. They manufactured fake violations, hired criminals to pose as law enforcement, and collected money through systematic intimidation. The damage they caused extends beyond the monetary. They eroded trust in legitimate authority and made people afraid in their own homes. This court hopes that today's sentences send a clear message that such behavior will be met with serious and lasting consequences. She brought down the gavel, and I watched as bailiffs escorted Karen and Dylan out of the courtroom in handcuffs. Karen was crying again, the same helpless tears she'd shed during the public arrest. But there was no sympathy in the room. The people she'd victimized watched in silence as she was led away to begin a 12-year sentence, 3 months after sentencing. Lakewood Meadows was a different place. The fake HOA had been formally dissolved and replaced with a legitimate, democratically elected community association with transparent bylaws and financial oversight. All 23 victim families received full restitution from the seized assets, and the 4 families who'd filed the initial complaints received additional compensation from Michigan's Crime Victim Fund. 12 new families moved into the neighborhood, attracted by the peaceful reputation that had been restored after the fraud operation was dismantled. I received a commendation from the Oakland County Board for professional handling of the investigation, but the real reward was watching a community rebuild trust and safety. I never saw Karen or Dylan again after that courtroom. Karen was transferred to Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility with prisoner number 847392. Dylan went to a medium security facility downstate. Both would serve the majority of their sentences before any chance of release, and both would carry felony records that would follow them for the rest of their lives. As for me, I kept doing my job, enforcing the law, protecting communities, and making sure that people who thought fake badges and manufactured authority could replace real accountability learned exactly how wrong they were. Real power doesn't need costumes or threats. It just needs evidence, procedure, and the patience to let justice work the way it's supposed to. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in accountability over intimidation and justice over revenge, support the Karma Clause channel. We bring you real stories about real consequences, where people who abuse power face the systems they thought they could manipulate. Subscribe, share, and let us know in the comments what justice means to you, because in the end, fake authority always loses to real accountability. Always.